Something about that afternoon felt wrong long before anyone understood just how far things were about to spiral. In our neighborhood, the HOA had spent years pretending to be the law. They wore badges that meant nothing, carried radios like real officers, and strutted around the gates like they owned every street, every driveway, every breath of air behind those fences. Most people rolled their eyes and stayed quiet. It was easier that way, until the day they crossed a line you can't uncross. It started with a visitor pulling up to the front gate. Nothing dramatic at first, just a car, a routine stop, and one simple request from the so-called HOA security team: open the trunk. Let them search the vehicle. The visitor refused. Calmly, politely, that should have been the end of it. But power has a strange effect on people who were never meant to hold it. Voices got louder. Orders turned into threats. And then someone pulled a trigger. The worst part, they had absolutely no idea who they had just shot. If you had driven through our neighborhood on a normal day, you probably would have thought it was the perfect suburban dream. Clean sidewalks, identical houses lined up like they were copied and pasted. Trimmed lawns that looked like they were measured with a ruler. Everything was quiet, controlled, and almost too polished to feel real. But that calm image hid something most visitors didn't notice at first. The people who believed they controlled it all. The HOA board had slowly transformed from a group that handled landscaping complaints into something far more aggressive. At the center of it was Brenda Sterling, the unofficial commander of what she proudly called the Security Task Force. She had gathered a small group of loyal followers who wore reflective vests, carried radios, and patrolled the neighborhood like they were guarding a military base instead of a quiet residential block. They set up checkpoints at the gate, questioned visitors, and handed out warnings for things as trivial as a mailbox being the wrong shade of gray. At first, everyone laughed about it. Then the warnings turned into fines. And the fines turned into intimidation. People stopped arguing because pushing back only made things worse. The HOA patrol loved power, and the more people avoided them, the more confident they became. Eventually, they stopped acting like neighbors and started behaving like law enforcement. The problem was, none of them actually were. A few days before everything fell apart, I had scheduled a meeting with a man named Arthur. It was supposed to be routine, just another professional conversation like dozens I'd had before. Still, something about him felt different from the start. He spoke calmly, carefully, like someone used to choosing every word with precision. When I suggested we meet at my office, he declined almost immediately. I offered a cafe downtown instead. Again, he refused, polite but firm. Then he made a suggestion that caught me off guard. He asked if we could meet at my house. Most people would prefer the opposite. Offices and cafes feel neutral, public, safe. But Arthur didn't seem interested in those kinds of places. He explained that he valued privacy, that he preferred quiet environments where conversations wouldn't be interrupted. His voice carried the confidence that made you stop questioning things too deeply. So, I agreed. Even then, there was a strange feeling I couldn't quite explain. He didn't give many personal details, no long introductions, no casual small talk. Just a simple message saying he'd arrive Wednesday afternoon and that he'd call when he reached the neighborhood gate. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I just assumed he was a cautious businessman. What I didn't realize was the moment he pulled up to that gate, everything in our quiet neighborhood was about to explode. The first sign that something had gone terribly wrong wasn't the shouting. It was the sound that came before it. A single sharp crack that echoed across the neighborhood and bounced off the quiet rows of houses. For a second, everything felt frozen. Then the noise started. People yelling, car doors slamming, someone shouting from the direction of the gate. My stomach tightened as I hurried down the street. The closer I got, the louder the chaos became. When I finally turned the corner and saw what was happening, my heart nearly stopped. Arthur was on the ground beside his car. One of the doors hung open, and he was gripping his leg, his hand already soaked with blood that was spreading across the pavement. A dark stain crept through the fabric of his pants, while a small crowd of neighbors stood several feet away. Stunned, phones raised, recording everything. Two of the HOA patrol members stood nearby, both wearing those ridiculous reflective vests they treated like uniforms. One of them still had his gun in his hand. His arms trembled slightly, but his voice came out loud and defensive. He refused the search. He snapped toward the crowd. He wouldn't cooperate. The words sounded absurd, even as he said them. A man was bleeding on the ground, and they were still trying to justify it, like they were enforcing parking rules. I pushed through the onlookers and dropped beside Arthur, pressing my jacket against his wound while people argued and shouted behind me. All around us, phones continued recording neighbors whispering in disbelief. And standing there, trying to defend the indefensible, the HOA officers still looked convinced they had done nothing wrong. I looked up at them, disbelief burning hotter than the fear in my chest. "What were you thinking?" I demanded, my voice shaking but loud enough for everyone around us to hear. "You shot him over a car search." The man holding the gun straightened, as if the vest on his shoulder somehow made him legitimate. "He refused compliance," he said sharply. "That makes him a threat." A threat. The word echoed in my head as I pressed harder against Arthur's wound, trying to slow the bleeding. He hadn't lunged at anyone. He hadn't shouted. From everything I could see, he had simply said no. Behind me, the crowd had grown. More neighbors stepped closer, phones lifted, cameras recording every second. The murmurs spread through the group like electricity. People were angry now. Shock was turning into outrage. "Put the gun down," someone from the crowd yelled. For a moment, the man hesitated. His partner shifted nervously beside him, glancing at the growing wall of cameras pointed in their direction. The confidence they had carried around the neighborhood for months was beginning to crack. You could see it in the way they avoided eye contact and the way their voices lost that commanding edge. Yet the weapon was still there, inches from another disaster. And in that tense silence, everyone seemed to realize the same thing at once. This situation was far from over. The sirens arrived minutes later, cutting through the tension that had settled over the street. Real police officers stepped out of their cruisers, their expressions shifting the moment they saw the scene and injured man on the pavement. Two nervous HOA officers and a crowd of witnesses holding up phones. Questions started flying immediately. What happened? Who fired the weapon? Why was this man on the ground? One of the patrol members tried to explain, repeating the same line about a refused vehicle search, but the officers weren't buying it. They moved quickly, securing the weapon and kneeling beside Arthur while paramedics rushed in. That's when everything changed. One of the officers asked for identification, while helping him onto the stretcher. Arthur reached slowly into his jacket and handed over a wallet. The officer opened it, glanced down, and froze. The silence that followed felt heavy. When the officer looked back up, his entire posture had changed. His voice dropped as he spoke quietly to his partner. The man they had just shot wasn't some random visitor. He was federal judge Arthur Reed. By the next morning, the quiet neighborhood that once prided itself on control looked nothing like it had the day before. Word had spread faster than anyone could contain it. Videos from the scene were already circulating online, showing the moment Arthur lay injured while the HOA patrol tried to justify what they had done. What had started as a local incident had suddenly drawn attention far beyond our streets. Then, the real authorities arrived. Dark government vehicles rolled through the entrance gate that the HOA once guarded so proudly. Federal agents stepped out with a calm confidence that immediately shifted the balance of power. They didn't ask many questions at first. They already seemed to know enough. The two men who had called themselves HOA security were taken into custody right there in front of everyone. Their radios, badges, and weapons were collected like props from a failed performance. For the first time since I had known them, they looked small. Investigators began speaking with witnesses, reviewing the footage neighbors had captured, and digging through HOA records. Brenda Sterling's influence vanished almost overnight. The same authority she had used to intimidate others collapsed under the weight of real law. And as the investigation unfolded, one truth became impossible to ignore. The moment they fired that shot, the power they thought they had disappeared completely.